Chapter 10. WrestleMania 2 and 3. I suppose if I could ever take a match back, it would be the one I had at WrestleMania 2 in 1986. It wasn't even a wrestling match. For some reason, Vince McMahon asked me if I would box Mr. T. Honestly, I really didn't like Mr. T. So being upfront, I told Vince that there was no way that I would take a dive for the star of the A-Team, and he assured me that I wouldn't have to. Satisfied, I agreed, and the match was booked as one of the top matches for the Federation's premier event of the year. In preparation, McMahon sent me to a boxing camp in Reno, Nevada, run by legendary trainer Lou Duva. Also at the camp were boxing stars Evander Holyfield, Leon Spinks, Dwight Braxton, and Tyrell Biggs, who was just getting ready to fight Mike Tyson. So here I am, a wrestler, and I'm in this camp with these guys, trying to get in shape for a boxing match. Overnight, McMahon wanted me to go from the road, where I was tired as a dog and downing beers like they were going out of style, to a place where they get up at 4 a.m. to run 5 miles. I went from drinking luxurious bottles of Miller Lite with my frat brothers to running in the park with ducks and these high-caliber boxers. All of a sudden I was asked to be Carl Lewis. I wasn't in shape for this. I hadn't been doing any road work for years, I was too busy wrestling, and on top of all that my hip was killing me. But Duva didn't mess around in these camps. He had us sparring, hitting the bag, all that fun stuff. I have to admit I was getting in better shape, but I was also getting the dog beat out of me by these guys. But while I was there, I made the best of the situation. I became pretty good friends with Evander Holyfield. At the beginning of camp there was a card and Duva was introducing all the boxers to everyone, and they were all getting a nice round of applause. But when he got to me, the cheers turned to rising unbelievable boos. I responded to the jeers by putting my arm around Holyfield, who was standing right next to me. I grabbed the mic and said, "You're all just jealous because you had to pay to come here to see us and we got in for free." Holyfield didn't know how to react to my statement, and he just politely said, "Oh geez, Mr. Piper, please don't do that." Even though I was out of my element for 4 weeks, I learned an awful lot from Duva and the boys. I came back in better shape and better prepared for my match against Mr. T. But even though I learned the ropes from Duva about boxing, I should have known that I'd regret my decision to box Mr. T for practice before our bout. I was brought in to go a few rounds with him in a ring set up in a warehouse. Vince McMahon and the booker George Scott were also there. This was the only contact in the ring I had with Mr. T prior to the match. We started fisticuffing a bit, and I had his head under my arm in a guillotine position. I wanted very much to shoot with Mr. T then, but neither Scott nor McMahon was giving me a clear high sign. I was working under the rules that any problem you had to take care of, you take care of it in the dressing room. When you're out in front of the camera or a live audience, it is always strictly professional. There was a lot of talk about what was really going to happen in this particular match, especially after I had vented my feelings about Mr. T. I was not overbearing, but I was as obnoxious, rude, and egotistical as a person could get. I cared for no one, and I thought no one cared for me. The match was going to take place at the Nassau Coliseum in New York, and it had sold out within a few hours. It was part of a card that was taking place in 3 different locations, a first in wrestling history. WrestleMania 2 was also being beamed by satellite from the Rosemont Horizon in Chicago, with wrestlers like Andre the Giant and Big John Studd against some of the Chicago Bears in a battle royal, and Hogan was going to be in Los Angeles at the LA Sports Arena facing King Kong Bundy in a steel cage match. Before WrestleMania 2, I had gotten into some trouble in Phoenix because of some things I had said about Mr. T during a press conference before a match on a Saturday night main event. I had been living pretty hard before this incident. I hadn't slept in 3 days. There was quite a bit of drinking going on because I was so tired of being on the road away from my family that I was getting to the point where nothing mattered anymore. I arrived in Arizona that evening and made my way over to the conference, which was held in a large room that was filled with people I had never seen before. In one corner there was McMahon, in another there were press people from NBC, and in a third corner were trainers who I didn't recognize. It was a very odd atmosphere. But I didn't care. Here I came barreling in and everyone's asking what's going to happen to Mr. T on the TV that night, and I answered them, simple. I'm going to take my waist belt off my kilt and I'm going to whip him like a slave. I was so aggressive that day and no one was saying anything, not even McMahon. Sure enough, that night on NBC I got Mr. T down and I took the waist belt off my kilt and I whipped him. This was also where I pushed the envelope. I said that slavery was a terrible thing and I was glad that they had ended it, but I also said that it made me wonder why one of the first things that Mr. T did when slavery ended was to put chains around his neck. Well, that sure got a lot of raw attention, and it's safe to say that not everyone was a big Roddy Piper fan after that night in Phoenix. But I wasn't done yet. After the match, I came into the hotel lobby carrying my Halliburton, and there was Vince McMahon and his entourage and the booker George Scott. At that time my relationship with Vince McMahon was beginning to wear a bit thin. I was very much a believer that you are your own man, and as such, I should dictate how I got to the outcome of a match. Vince, however, was trying to turn wrestling into sports entertainment, which was dead against everything that I had been taught. Well, Scott and I didn't really get along and tensions were rising when we saw each other and I kind of bumped him, so he took his finger and put it in my mouth to kind of hook my cheek. We were very close to ribbing on the square here. It was real close to rock and roll. But when he put his finger in my mouth, I bit down hard on his finger, managing to hang on to my Halliburton, and I walked him all around the lobby in a circle back to the elevators, where McMahon and his entourage were trying to get on. At that time I let Scott go and put my Halliburton down. When the doors opened, Scott got on the elevator with Vince and his crowd, but every time the doors went to close, I bumped them open and said, "Come on, you motherfuckers." I was challenging them all and they didn't know what to do. Finally one of McMahon's producers ran out of the elevator when he saw another elevator open, and he grabbed my Halliburton and put it in that elevator. I had no choice but to let them go as I raced to the second elevator to grab my case before the door closed. I had been pushed so hard at that point I was just out of my head. Also during this time, just before WrestleMania 2, these guys had me doing whatever they wanted. They never thought, Hot Rod will never do it. They just assumed I would. One day I asked where we were going, and they said, "We're going to Philadelphia. We're going to see Joe Frazier." "You're going to go into his gym and challenge him?" I said. "Does Joe know that we're coming?" They told me no, but that they'd call him when we got down there. So we get to Philadelphia to Joe Frazier's gym. Mind you, we're not in the best part of town. I walk in wearing my kilt and the whole 9 yards for this publicity bit. All these boxers turn to look at me and wonder what the heck is going on. I yell, "Where is Joe Frazier? I've come to kick his ass." All of a sudden you see Joe standing in the doorway of his office, which was above the ring. He stood in the doorway the whole doorway and he says, "I'm Joe Frazier." I'm now thinking, oh shit, I'm gonna die. He comes down and he's carrying this medicine ball in his hands. I immediately put my hands behind my back and tell him, "Go ahead, Joe, give your best shot." Joe then takes the medicine ball and whips it into my belly. I then meant to say, "Go ahead, Joe, do it again." But in reality it kind of came out like, "GG go head, J Joe, do it again," as I had nearly all my wind knocked out of me. So Joe winds up and boom, fires that thing again. Well, again, in my mind the words sounded a lot different than how they actually came out. In my head I was saying, "See, I ain't afraid of nobody, I can take anything," but I could barely get the words out of my mouth in a whisper, as Joe's last blast surely not only hurt like a motherfucker, but it also left me gasping for air. Now I know Joe's real name, Mr. Frazier. WrestleMania 2. Finally, the match was about to begin and I exuded confidence. By my side I had the great Lou Duva, for whom I have all the respect and love in the world. He had a plaid robe made for me that said Hot Rod on the back. Also with us was his right-hand man, George Benton, one of the greatest trainers in the world. Together, they taught me little tricks like laying your right hand on your chest so you don't get tired, professional secrets. Wearing my plaid robe, I got into the ring, and Joan Rivers, who was a special guest announcer for the event, said to me, "Why do you always act so mean?" Well, in the middle of Nassau Coliseum and in front of 17,000 people, with my match about to start, I really didn't want to get into it with Joan Rivers. I was now pumped for the match. It was no secret how much I hated Mr. T. Even the wrestlers were curious to see how the match was going to turn out. They were betting among themselves, saying things like, "I bet you Piper takes him out in the first round. I bet you Piper takes him out in the second round," and so forth. The wrestlers themselves are figuring pretty much that Roddy Piper is going to shoot that night. But as I said, the rule was business in front of the camera is business and you take care of personal problems backstage. I was still looking for any kind of high sign from McMahon that I was going to be allowed to take this guy out, but I wasn't getting any. Just before the bell rang I realized that I had forgotten my mouthpiece. Luckily, Lou Duva thought quickly and improvised, getting some gauze and sticking it up in between my teeth. It was a poor man's mouthpiece, for sure, but I didn't let it affect my confidence. Throughout the first round people were cheering for Mr. Ton, booing the dog out of me. At the beginning of the match, having been blessed all my life with fairly fast hands, I threw a few left jabs that caught Mr. T. He then countered with a combination of his own that caught me, but I kept coming at him with lefts and rights. While I was outboxing Mr. T, I really wasn't hurting him. You see, when they put my gloves on, I had to roll my fists so that my hands weren't in the actual glove. Meaning, When I hit Mr. T, only the glove was hitting him, not my fist. But the same rule didn't apply to T, he had his gloves on the right way. To make things more infuriating, the commentators, Susan St. James and Vince, were terrible. Susan was tossing out really dry comments, not lending anything to the telecast. She was just making a bad situation worse. In the second round they gave me a mouthpiece and things began to look up, so I thought. At about the middle of the round, the crowd started chanting my name. It came very slowly and from the bowels of the building and built up until it consumed the whole arena. The crowd was now behind me 100%, and at this time Mr. T and I came to a predetermined spot in the ring where I was going to let him knock me down with a left hook. I knew he was going to throw the left and I would have to fall out of the ring, but I had a slight problem. I was trying to figure out how I was going to get from the ring, through the ropes, and onto the concrete floor 5 feet below us. I couldn't grab the ropes to break my fall because I had no thumbs on my gloves. Anyway, as this was going through my mind, he threw the punch and bang, I fly. The only problem was, as my luck would have it, he missed. But I had no idea. Sometimes you can't feel punches after a while and nobody had ever missed me before, so I wasn't sure. Mr. T wasn't a professional, and it showed. I've been working with pros all my life, not amateurs like T, and I take full responsibility for what happened. As a pro, I should have known better. I was told later on that he missed me by a good 8 inches. The people at the Nassau Coliseum, like me, didn't know what had just happened, but the people sitting at home sure knew. The camera angle made it really evident that he had missed me by a mile. It was the most humiliating thing that could have happened to me considering the stature and reputation that I had in my sport. Even though I wasn't aware of the miss, I was still terribly angry in the ring and wanted to take this guy out so bad. The plan for the third round was for me to knock Mr. T down 2 times. I got on him immediately and he went down once. After he got up, I went back after him, but he never went down a second time. He let the round run out without taking another fall. Now I was furious. I went back to my corner and my ring crew told me to sit down, but I wasn't ready to sit. I was so frustrated that I just picked up my stool and flung it as hard as I could at Mr. T, taking a chunk out of his leg. I thought maybe it would provoke him to take a shot at me, which would justify me and shooting with him so I could take him out. But he never did. I wound up losing the match via disqualification after body slamming him in sheer frustration. I consider this match to be a black mark in my career, all because Mr. T didn't have the experience to make the key punch connect. The match was a really good slap in the face for me because my head and ego were too big at the time, but I also should have trusted my instincts and knocked him out when I wanted to. You see, he didn't follow the rules. The rules say that it's better to knock your opponent's teeth down his throat than to hit him with a popcorn punch. But that match also marked a turning point in my career. The entire Nassau Coliseum had changed in 1.5 rounds from cheering for Mr. T to chanting Piper, Piper, Piper. This started a huge wave of fan support that quickly led to me becoming the fan favorite. All of a sudden Vince McMahon didn't know what to do, as his top heel had turned into his top babyface. Now Roddy Piper was even more popular than Hulk Hogan. It became a real fight with the powers that be from then on. With my star status full-blown at this time, Hogan told me that he had gone to Vince and said that he would just ride on my kilts, if you will, in an attempt to keep within the moral code. But he was also trying to test his position with McMahon, and the WWF boss told him not to worry about it, that he would take care of the situation. Thus the battle began between Roddy Piper and Vince McMahon. If you didn't take care of yourself, you would get beaten, and McMahon was definitely trying to suppress me. The amount of animosity was unparalleled. I was doing my part, living up to everything that they said I was. But I was also taking care of my duties. During this period of time I was still doing Piper's Pit, and Kitty and I had our second child, another beautiful little girl, Ariel, my swan. I was managing to maintain the struggle. There was talk about me fighting Mike Tyson in a 5-round exhibition match in New York for the reopening of the renovated Statue of Liberty. I would have done it, but it just never happened. Electrocution. As if putting my life on the line inside the ring wasn't enough, I had some encounters outside the squared circle that almost cost me my life. Right before WrestleMania 3, I was wrestling on a card in LA at the Sports Arena. This particular night I happened to be on last, and after my match I was hanging out with Harley Race, Mitch Ackerman, a dear friend of mine, and some other folks I just can't remember who right now, which you will understand in a second. Well, we were just kind of shooting the breeze in the dressing room, mostly waiting for the crowd to leave so we could get out of the building and avoid the traffic jam. The way the dressing rooms were set up, you got changed in one room and then went to another room to shower, and then you came back to dry off and get dressed. Also, in this dressing room, they had many makeup mirrors, which had the big light bulb lights around them, just like you see actors and actresses use in the movies. Well, as I was talking to the guys, I put my towel on top of my Halliburton, which was sitting on the top shelf near one of these lights. I stripped down into my birthday suit, and went to the other room to shower, forgetting to take my towel with me. When I was done showering, I went back into the dressing room soaking wet, in search of my towel. Leaving a pool of water beneath me, I reached for my towel next to my case and I began talking to Harley. The next thing I knew, I slipped on the water that was dripping off my wet, naked body and fell toward the mirror. In the process of slipping on the drenched floor, my left index finger accidentally went into one of the empty bulb sockets, causing me to get electrocuted. This blew me back 3 feet into my chair, and everybody looked at me like, "What is Piper doing now?" Nobody had any idea what had just happened. The wrestlers couldn't put 2 and 2 together, and even when they did, they usually came out with 3. Finally, after a little foaming from my mouth, they thought maybe they should ask me if I was okay. By this time in my career, I had been taught to show no pain. No retreat, no surrender was my creed. As everyone left the dressing room and I started getting dressed, my good friend Mitch and I went to a sushi bar. However, as the night progressed, I got more confused and nauseous, at which time I asked my friend if he would take me back to my hotel room. Okay folks, I get a little murky here. I don't know how, but I had a plane ticket for Minneapolis the next morning, and somehow I got on a plane that took me to Kansas City. I got off the plane in Kansas City, and I had been there enough to know that you stay at the Mari Rot by the KC airport. Being a creature of habit, I headed for the Mari Rot, thinking I had a room there. I began to walk the halls on every floor until security came and said, "Mr. Piper, can I help you?" I said, "Yeah." "Could you tell me where the hell I am?" From this point on, it was basically get him to the hospital. It turned out that I had taken quite a jolt from the electricity, and was sent home to Portland. To this day, the only thing I want to give myself credit for is that the LA Sports Arena was remodeled entirely to protect the athletes, as I sued their ass and won. I kept calling my wife, the WWF office, and everyone from the hospital to figure out where I was supposed to be after I got electrocuted, and kept insisting to the doctors, nurses, and wrestlers who I was talking to that I had to be in Norfolk. As rough as wrestlers could be at times on one another, they knew something was wrong with me, especially since we hadn't been in Norfolk in 10 years. After many tests and exams in the hospital and my retaining a very good lawyer named Carol Fries out of LA, I was able to take on and beat the LA Sports Arena and their dangerous working conditions. WrestleMania 3. At the time of WrestleMania 3, I had been fighting against the establishment that wanted to diminish my real estate value as a professional wrestler, and I knew I couldn't keep fighting them forever. So I devised a plan. The only way I could keep my real estate value and stay on top was if I retired. I figured if I retired at the peak of my career and went into another industry and had success, it would prevent the WW from pushing me down and diminishing my value in the sport. I must admit it was a pretty scary, ballsy move, but I decided to go ahead with it. Early in 1987, I told Vince McMahon that I didn't want to do Piper's Pit anymore because I thought it was getting old, never letting him know what I was up to. Plus, I've always believed that you should always quit just before the clapping reaches its peak. That way it will always give you another run. Vince didn't want me to end the show, but I let him know that my match at WrestleMania 3 was going to be my retirement match. The card was to take place at the Pontiac Silverdome, with the main event being Hulk Hogan vs. Andre the Giant for the world title. When Vince McMahon made the posters for WrestleMania 3, they read Andre the Giant vs. Hulk Hogan, and then, in small print, Roddy Piper's retirement match. He didn't want to give me any credit at all. This was Vince's way of doing as much damage to me as he could. Since I had to continue to do the Piper's Pit until WrestleMania 3, I used one segment to break the news to the public that I was retiring. In an interview, I just said, "Daddy's coming home." After the goodbye speech, Don Morocco came out horse laughing and said, "Thanks, you just killed off every babyface in the territory." But before I went on that night, Vince kept hounding me to find out what I was going to do. Finally I told him, "Vince, just let me go out there," and he backed off. I guess he must have been worried about what I was going to say, but I did the right thing. I put the WWF in its right perspective by thanking it. As much as I may have differences with the WWF, I did do great things for the WWF, and the WWF did great things for me. However, it was war and I was determined to survive. The setup for the main event was done on Piper's Pit. Hogan and Andre were doing the interview and Andre was supposed to rip off the cross Hulk was wearing. Well, I had a problem with this, as I will not use the Lord's name in vain, and this seemed to go against that belief. It was a very confusing time for me, morally and professionally. As the interview progressed, Andre finally reached over and ripped the cross off Hogan, and as he did this, his nails clawed the Hulkster and then there was a little bit of blood. And just before we went off the air, I said to Hogan, "You're bleeding." It was perfect timing, and this added element really made the angle pop. There was a record crowd of 93,000 people on hand that night in the Pontiac Silverdome, and one of them was a movie director named John Carpenter. I had never heard of him, but my friend Dave Wolf said Carpenter wanted to meet me and talk to me. So I agreed to meet him afterward. Hey, a free dinner is a free dinner. I really didn't think much about it at the time. Throughout WrestleMania 3 there was an electric cart shaped like a miniature wrestling ring that transported the competing wrestlers to the actual ring. When it was my turn to go out, they were having problems with the cart. Something was broken and I could hear the crowd. I knew the time was now, but Vince kept telling me to wait, that they'd fix the cart. But I said, fuck it. I opened the curtain and just started running down the aisle. I don't know if it was a combination of the fans thinking that it was the last time they were going to see me or the fact that I was running into the ring, but they went nuts. I didn't need no stinking cart to go into the ring. If I couldn't run into the ring, what business did I have being in there as a fighter? When I got into that ring, the people in that arena gave me a sensation that I'll never forget in my whole life. You can look back at that tape, nobody got a bigger response than me. Even the ringside announcers, Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby Heenan, couldn't hear each other, as the cheering was so deafening. That moment was almost worth all the broken bones and bad trips. There was one moment when I changed out of my normal MO and I looked around that arena with sincerity, looking at all those people who had basically saved my ass and gotten me into a position where I could earn a good living and have a half-decent life. This was an incredible time in my career. In came Adrian Adonis, aka Keith Frankie. I loved this guy along with his manager, Jimmy Hart. My very good friend was set to take me on in my last hurrah, and we had an entertaining match. It was a hair versus hair match, and the loser of the match had to get his hair cut. Adrian lost the match, and that is how Brutus the Barber was born. It was just an improv by me. I had already beaten Adrian and was having some fun with it since the people were going crazy. It was a great moment, and I just said to Brutus, "You cut his hair." I handed him the big shears I had been given and he cut his hair and thus became Brutus the Barber Beefcake. The whole atmosphere of WrestleMania 3 was incredible. I didn't get another reception like that until I went overseas to wrestle. And I must admit that for my retirement match, McMahon put on the best presentation I have seen. They played Frank Sinatra's song My Way and showed highlights of my career, and at the end of the video, they showed me wearing a Hulk Hogan t-shirt in the war to settle the score and saying I love you. This came off looking like I was endorsing Hulk Hogan. Of course I had to call Vince later about it, and he just started laughing. He was and is a very calculating and cunning man. After the match, Dave Wolf was waiting to escort me back to my dressing room. When Vince saw the two of us together, I could tell that he didn't like it. This created animosity between us and quite frankly was the beginning of the end of our relationship. You see, folks, I'm just trying to give you the temperature and atmosphere at the time between Vince and me. After the amazing event, I kicked back and had dinner with John Carpenter, and people were sending me bottles of Cristal champagne. I could feel the tears in their eyes as I made mimosas with it. As we were having dinner, Carpenter offered me the lead in his next film, They Live. It was as simple as that, folks. We were eating dinner. John Carpenter said, "Would you pass me the butter, please?" Dave said, "Would you pass me a roll, please?" Carpenter said, "Would you like to star in my next movie?" I said, "Sure. Are there any more of those rolls left?" And we never talked another word about the movie that night. However, don't let me fool you folks into thinking I was just naive because I had big black wings by that time and it was very hard to fool. I knew that McMahon was trying to bury me, and like I said before, I needed to make a dramatic move to increase my real estate value. So I gave my word to do the movie without even knowing what it was about. When McMahon found out about the deal, he came up to me and said, "I will have you a movie within 4 weeks that pays the same amount if you stay." I said, "Not with John Carpenter directing it," since I knew what McMahon was up to. Let me be real honest with you folks. I didn't need another Hell Comes to Frogtown. I still to this day claim that it was my evil twin brother who did that movie, which was what McMahon probably would have gotten me. I just left Vince and the WWF behind, and the next thing I knew I was in John Carpenter's backyard, taking acting lessons and making the movie with the hard knocks of wrestling behind me. Just about the time They Live came out in 1988 and was the #1 box office hit its first weekend in the theaters, I needed to communicate with McMahon about my dilemma with the electrocution court case. During his communication with Freeze, My lawyer, McMahon, sent a message to me to tell Piper that Hogan and I are the only true blue WWFers. Until that time, Hogan and I were known to the promotion as the franchise. But after WrestleMania 3, McMahon made it clear that I was not part of the family anymore. What he did not realize is that I have never had a family other than the beautiful one I have created myself through God's help. McMahon told me, the WWF doesn't need Roddy Piper. I then looked him in the eye and said, Roddy Piper doesn't need the WWF, and I proceeded to go on to get a #1 hit movie, the first wrestler in history to accomplish this feat. I knew McMahon was dead wrong because all of the education I had been given by the old-timers showed me that even if I went out and got a #1 movie, I could come back to the WWF and still be untouchable. And I did come back to do voice-overs as well as wrestle. But, folks, as the stakes rise, so does the psychology.